I know what some of you guys are thinking, and yes, I've said this before and I'll say it again, this video is going up a little bit before this album's actual 10-year anniversary. The reason is there are a lot of albums that I want to talk about in this series in November. Specifically, there's like 7 of them, and that's a lot to handle in 1 month. So I've pretty much decided that I'm gonna start just pushing some of those November videos into October so that I'm not crunching myself, especially when the end of the year rolls around and I'm making my lists for 2020 albums. So because I'm pushing those back, I'm also pushing the other October albums I want to talk about forward a little bit. So expect that a number of these 10 years later videos are going to be coming a lot earlier. Again, it's just because I don't want to be crunching during the month of November or doing 2-in-1 10 years later videos, because that's not really ideal and that's not what I want to do. Just thought I'd say that now. Let's get right into the video. As I said, welcome back to 10 years later, the series where I talk about albums from the 2010s that were either impactful to me, impactful to music in general, very popular, or just worth revisiting 10 years later for good or bad reasons. And as you can tell by the title, the album that we will be talking about today is the 2010 Taylor Swift album, Speak Now. Taylor Swift doesn't need an introduction. She's a pop titan that has dominated for well over the last decade, and I've talked about her several times between my blog and this channel. Hell, I just talked about her a few months ago when I reviewed her latest album, Folklore, which has definitely been one of my favorite projects this year. Taylor has continued to be on fire for an incredibly long time, and she has overcome a lot but has ended up on top every time. And I was pretty interested in revisiting this record because it came at a time when Taylor was still pretty strictly ingrained in the country pop sound. Yes, her new records have sort of seen returns to stylings of country and folk, but after Speak Now, Taylor really started to distance herself from the country sounds and went more for a straight pop sound. I was also interested in revisiting this record because while I haven't been the biggest Taylor Swift fanatic, and I was not much of a fan of hers back in 2010 when I was very anti-pop music, I've very much come to appreciate a lot of her older catalog lately. This is going to be a bit of a personal anecdote, but I think part of the reason why I've been appreciating Taylor's music a little bit more is because a couple years ago when I was working in retail, many of Taylor Swift's old songs were in heavy rotation at the store I was working at, and personally I didn't mind it. I enjoyed hearing songs like Fearless, this album's big singles Mine and Back to December, and even tracks like If This Was a Movie and Superman that were included as bonus songs on the deluxe edition of the album. So I was interested in going back to seeing if the rest of the album delivered like those songs that were in heavy rotation for me did. The record is 14 tracks and just over an hour long, which definitely got me a bit worried at first, but then again, that kind of length is par for the course for Taylor Swift, and I was genuinely surprised because despite the length, this album is filled with hits. I'd honestly go as far as to say this is one of Taylor's finest projects. Right off the bat, this album was loaded with songs that received single releases. I think I could see why Taylor doesn't release albums as frequently as some other pop artists, just because she gets a lot of longevity out of her singles. And I gotta say, the singles from this thing still hit to this day. Mine kicks off the album. This is a track I've enjoyed far more than I could have ever imagined. It's definitely a very smooth piece of pop, but it's one that works so well thanks to Taylor's vocal personality and the absolutely killer chorus. Taylor's vocals do sound a bit more youthful here. Understandably, she was 21 when this album came out, but honestly, yeah, I like this. Sparks Fly leans more into the country sound, and apparently this was a song that Taylor wrote when she was 16 and later reworked for the album, and I'm glad she did. The writing here is pretty solid, and Taylor sells the song with her welcoming vocals and natural ability to craft really sticky choruses. Back to December is another track that I got a lot of longevity out of, and I never knew this, but apparently this song was written about Taylor's ex, Taylor Lautner, who I never knew she dated. I should also say that I know people joke a lot about Taylor making a lot of songs about her exes, but I'm not going to, because who am I to dictate a woman's dating life or decide who she should be writing about? Anyway, this is a track I've returned to a lot. It's far mellower than a lot of what else is here, but I think Taylor sounds wonderful as always, and I think her apologetic lyrics are pretty compelling too. The title track, Speak Now, was a promotional single, and it was supposedly inspired by Hayley Williams, who had an experience attending the wedding of an ex-lover and ex-bandmate of Paramore. It's another song with a light instrumental, but Taylor proves to be game for it with sweet vocals, and I think her writing is very solid. This is the kind of topic that could go really wrong if it's handled too goofily, but Taylor does a nice job with it, making the song pretty enjoyable. Mean was a track written in response to music critic Bob Lefsetz, who wrote a scathing review about a performance Taylor did back in 2010 with Stevie Nicks. Supposedly, he said that Taylor couldn't sing and that her performance would kill her career, which, yeah, look at where we are now. Honestly, this is probably one of the better answering back at critics songs that I've heard. It doesn't go down the overly petty routes that you'd expect an artist of Taylor's structure to do, and it fortunately doesn't resort to the silly things things like, "You can't critique music because you don't make music." What's more, it's just a solid song with catchy vocal melodies and a nice bouncy instrumental. I know Bob seemed to double down on his critiques after the song came out and continued to say that Taylor couldn't sing and that the song was bad, but hey, you do you, Bob. The Story of Us feels more like a power pop song with throbbing instrumentals and lyrics that seem to be directed at her ex, John Mayer. It's a much harder song than a lot of what else is here. It carries a few rock vibes with some slick guitars, but it works well thanks again to Taylor's powerful vocals that fit very nicely up against these instrumentals. The production fortunately doesn't overpower her, and she does a great job meshing well with it. And fortunately, most of the deep cuts here are pretty good too. Dear John was another song that was supposedly directed at John Mayer, and it's a gentle song that stretches almost 7 minutes long. It's a classic Taylor Swift track 5 song, as Taylor has a penchant for making the 5th track on all of her albums very emotionally vulnerable. I love the vibe of the song, and Taylor's vocals sound rather sultry and broken, but I think it could have been shortened a little bit. I get the idea of Taylor having a lot to say, and that's totally valid, but with the fact that the song is rather slow, I do think the long length can work to its detriment. It's definitely not a bad song though, and Never Grow Up is one of the most beautiful of the deep cuts here, and really one of the most beautiful of all the songs on here. It's a track Taylor wrote about becoming the godmother to a friend's baby. I think some of her writing on this track is some of the finest I've ever heard out of her. I also love how stripped down the song is, as it consists only of an acoustic guitar and Taylor's delicate vocals. It might honestly stand up there as one of Taylor's best songs, and the raw emotion of it is palpable. Enchanted is another slightly longer song, as it almost reaches 6 minutes in length. The song is addressed to Adam Young of Owl City, who Taylor very much liked but worried was in love with someone else. Even despite the length and the somewhat slow feel of the song, this is definitely one of my favorites on the album. I love how varied Taylor's vocals are as she meshes between a lighter, more mellow tone and some somewhat bigger, more emotional singing. I also like how the instrumental flows here. It takes on a minimal feel, but becomes heavier without sacrificing a great sound. The song just flows perfectly, and it's another huge high point for Taylor. Better Than Revenge is a harder, rock-leaning song that seems to fire shots at Camila Bell, who tried to steal Joe Jonas from her when they were dating. This is one of the few tracks I don't love on here. I think Taylor's vocals are extremely charismatic, and the rock sound is a rather interesting change of pace, but I think the writing is some of Taylor's weakest on the album, and there's something about it that's just not really clicking with me. Maybe it could grow on me with repeat listens, but it's not one that I love. Innocent, though, is an interesting song, as it seems this was Taylor's response to Kanye West's viral interruption of her acceptance speech at the 2009 VMAs. Taylor seems to pretty much forgive Kanye for the incident, and she expresses a belief that Kanye could grow and be better from the situation, though it's a sad truth that he couldn't. Either way, I do think the song sounds nice, and Taylor's mature songwriting shines through. Even if the song is aesthetically a bit similar to some of the other ones here, still a decent song, and I kind of wish Kanye had just taken the forgiveness back then. Would have been a way better look. Haunted is a much different sounding song, with a more orchestral instrumental and a somewhat busy vibe. I love the dramatic production though, and I think Taylor proves that her vocal power can match up to an instrumental like this. It's kind of crazy because this almost sounded like a precursor to some of the later dips into pop music that Taylor would do with her next albums, and it's a pretty good precursor at that. Last Kiss is a much slower ballad thematically inspired by Taylor's breakup with Joe Jonas. It's another longer track, stretching to be just over 6 minutes, but surprisingly, despite the slow vibe of it, it doesn't lose my interest. Perhaps it's because of how different it sounds from everything else here. It's just some light pianos, acoustic guitars, and a minimal drum beat. Or perhaps it's how lovely Taylor's vocals are, but this is just such a sweet, irresistible song. I enjoy it way too much, and fortunately the length isn't much of a detriment. And the closer, Long Live, is another sweet pop rock song that sees Taylor reminiscing on great memories in what is a nice dedication to her fan base. This is the type of song that's too nice for me to resist, with some solid guitar strums and more of the excellent vocals we've come to expect from Taylor. There's really no better song she could have chosen to end the album with, and it's a really great track. Overall, I've got to say that I think this is one of my personal favorite Taylor Swift albums. I'm not particularly big on country music, but Taylor's old country sound is often irresistible. The instrumentals and the production are very sweet and easy on the ears, and even if they're relatively simple pop songs, they sound wonderful. Taylor's vocals also sound great all throughout the album, and I was very surprised by how mature the songwriting was throughout most of the album. I think there's a running joke about how country music often has terrible writing, but here Taylor's writing mostly very mature love songs that time has been very kind to. I think a lot of what's here has a timeless air to it, as if this isn't so much Taylor trying to jump on trends or make something that sounds popular, but rather just making lovely music that has appeal to a large audience. I was also impressed that despite the long length, there really wasn't all that much fat on the album that needed to be trimmed off. I expected there to be a few throwaway cuts, but for the most part, this is a very concise concise, consistent, and wonderful listen. I think that looking back on it a decade later, it still stands near the top of Taylor's discography, even if it was recently dethroned by Folklore, and it's an album I highly recommend listening to no matter what you think of Taylor Swift. Back in 2010, you wouldn't have caught me dead listening to Taylor Swift. No matter how good her music was, I was very disinterested in pop music at the time, and Taylor was one of those artists that I listened to the least and kinda just didn't like for no particular reason whatsoever. Listening to this album now though, I think it's a pretty great record, and personally one of my favorites from Taylor Swift. If I had to put it on my scale, I would honestly give it an excellent rating. I'm a bit surprised. I didn't think I'd love this as much as I did, but wow, Taylor did a really wonderful job with this album. Really nice stuff. But that's just my opinion on this record. What did you guys think about it? Did you listen to it back in 2010? Do you still listen to it now? Did you love it then, hate it then, love it now, hate it now? Are you indifferent towards Taylor Swift? Where would you rank this among her albums? And what kind of memories do you have listening to it? Whatever they are, whatever you'd like to say, leave your thoughts down in the comments section. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand and I won't beg you for it. In terms of what's next, I am planning to talk about Neo's 2010 album Libra Scale. Even though that wasn't an October album here in America, it came out in October in Japan supposedly, so that's next on my list. And I very much love Neo, so I'm very excited to get to talk about that for this series. So stay tuned for that video, but until next time, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.